Hello, Isaac here. Welcome back to my channel. I'm finally back with another part of the City of God series. This time we've arrived at book 2 of the City of Gods. So we've not made it very far, but here we go. So be sure to like, comment and subscribe. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. So what is book 2? Well, it's a thorough critique of the moral and philosophical foundations of Roman society as influenced by its pagan religion. And Augustine will argue the moral decay and eventual fall of Rome are due to the flawed teachings and values endorsed by its pagan worship and not the advent of Christianity, as his critics claim. So let's start with chapters 1 to 3, where Augustine begins by addressing the challenge, first of all, of debating the truth. So, in chapter 1 of book 2, Augustine begins by addressing the challenge of debating the truth, given that there is a resistance to it due to an unwillingness to understand or accept it. For these people, he writes, even after the truth has been fully demonstrated, as man can prove it to man, they hold for the very truth of their own reasonableness fancies, either on account of their great blindness which prevents them from seeing what is plainly set before them, or on account of their opinionative obstinacy, which prevents them from acknowledging the force of what they do see. So, given the stubbornness or blindness of many, truths often need to be elaborated on, but Augustine laments the futility of endlessly addressing every objection. Rhetoric has to come to terms with the lack of receptibility of some adversaries and the impossibility of responding to each and every point. So he urges Marcellinus, to whom he addresses this part, not to judge his work based on the ability to answer every single critique, and warns of the trap of perpetual debate without ever arriving at a clear understanding of the truth, referencing the apostolic warning in 2 Timothy 3:7 of people who are ever learning and never able to acknowledge the truth. Then, in chapter 2, Augustine will briefly summarize the task of his work again, which is a defense of the Christian faith against those who blame it for the fall of Rome and the calamities befalling the empire. And he recalls the previous arguments he has made in book 1. So, in book 1, he highlighted that during the sack of Rome, the barbarians often spared Christian sanctuaries out of reverence for Christ, so that many were exempted from the hardships which, by the custom of law, may lawfully be inflicted. The question which emerged out of this, however, was why both good and bad individuals alike suffered during such calamities, and particularly of Christian women who faced physical violations from invaders. Augustine's main point here was a reaffirmation of their spiritual purity. Moreover, he denounces those who mock these devout women and points out that the moral decline of the Romans, arguing that Rome was morally bankrupt long before its physical fall. He writes, in truth, Rome, which was founded and increased by the labours of these ancient heroes, was more shamefully ruined by their descendants, while its walls were still standing, than it is now by the razing of them. For in this ruin there fell stones and timbers, but in the ruining of these profligates and affected, there fell not the immoral, but the moral bulwarks and ornaments of the city, and their hearts burned with passions more destructive than the flames which consumed their houses. Augustine concludes the chapter by transitioning to discuss calamities Rome faced throughout its history, which will be the topic of this book, and suggests that if Christianity had been prominent then, it would have been wrongfully blamed for those events too. So in chapter 3, Augustine reiterates the ignorance of those who blame Christianity for various calamities. This is encapsulated apparently in the saying, drought, and Christianity go hand in hand. Augustine points out that educated individuals familiar with history and aware of the numerous disasters Rome faced long before the advent of Christianity are feigning ignorance in order to stoke the anger of the masses against Christians. Therefore, Augustine challenges them to recall the many misfortunes that had befallen Rome prior to Christ's arrival and questions why their gods did not prevent such calamities, especially since they claim to worship these gods for protection. He highlights an inconsistency in their argument, asking why their gods allowed such disasters before Christians ever began to offend these deities. So we turn to chapters 4 to 6, in which Augustine exposes the immorality of the pagan cults and myths. So in chapter 4, Augustine will begin by critiquing the pagan gods as they don't provide moral guidance to their followers. And he argues that they should have provided at least some moral laws to their devotees in return for their loyal worship. Instead, there is a total absence of any prophets or clear teachings from these gods promoting virtuous living. In fact, he recalls attending pagan festivals in his own youth and witnessing their sacrilegious spectacles. He writes, I myself, when I was a young man, used to sometimes go to the sacrilegious entertainments and spectacles. I saw the priests raving in religious excitement and heard the choristers. I took pleasure in the shameful games which were celebrated in honour of gods and goddesses, of the Virgin Colestis and Berecynthia, the mother of all the gods. Augustine tells us of the obscene performances held in honour of these gods, noting that such lewd acts held in honour of the mother of the gods were so disgraceful they wouldn't even be performed in front of one's own mother. Augustine asks, if these are sacred rites, what is sacrilegious? If this is purification, what is pollution? Augustine therefore contrasts these profane rites with what is expected of sacred ceremonies, pointing out that the stark difference, and condemns these pagan practices as not appeasing gods, but evil spirits, and challenges his readers to discern the true nature of entities that delight in such debauchery. Now, Augustine only hints at the obscene rites of the Roman gods, particularly of Cybele, the mother of the gods, and he doesn't directly tell us about those rites. But for those who don't know, the priests of the cult of Cybele were male eunuchs, and they would castrate themselves amid sexual pleasure as a means of symbolically offering up their own fertility to the mother goddess. Augustine is trying to highlight through this critique an apparent disconnect then between Roman values and the dishonourable practices tied to the worship of their gods. Augustine therefore sees these pagan customs as a sly trap designed to steer people away from true morality and piety. And in chapter 6, Augustine continues this line of argument, criticising the pagan deities for their lack of moral guidance, and asserting that these deities showed very little concern for the well-being of their worshippers, even allowing them to indulge in corrupt and detrimental behaviours. In fact, he challenged proponents of these religions to present any evidence of teachings or directives from these gods that promoted virtues, ethics, or moral living. He writes, let them show or name to us the places which were at any time consecrated to assemblances in which, instead of the obscene songs and licentious acting of players, instead of the celebration of those most filthy and shameless frugalia, well called frugalia since they banish modesty and right feeling, the people were commanded in the name of gods to restrain avarice, bridle impurity, and conquer ambition. This challenge of Augustine and the very absence of moral precepts from the gods is contrasted with what the first century satirist Persius tells us is the need for moral guidance. He quotes this passage from the poet as to what they ought to learn. Be taught, you abandoned creatures, and ascertain the causes of things, what we are, and for what end we are born, what is the law of our success in life, by what art we may turn the goal without making shipwreck, what limit we should put to our wealth, what we may lawfully desire, and what uses filthy lucre serves, how much we should bestow upon our country and our family. Learn, in short, what God meant you to be and what place he has ordered you to fill. Now, the irony of this poem for Augustine is that no one can name a place where such moral instructions are communicated from the gods, unless, that is, you were to attend a Christian church, which in fact do serve as places where believers learn about God's intentions for them and their place in the world, as well as how to live an ethical life. Essentially, Augustine is highlighting the moral vacuum in pagan religion while underscoring the clear ethical guidance provided by Christianity. And so, in chapter 7, Augustine turns to the teachings of the philosophers in relation to the customs and rituals of the Roman gods. He begins by noting the philosophical schools and their debates are originally Greek, not Roman, although they might be considered Roman since Greece was annexed by Rome. But he distinguishes between the teachings of the philosophers, which are human discoveries, and the commandments of the gods. Therefore, although philosophers have made considerable efforts to discover the hidden laws of nature and the right and wrong in ethics and the rules of logic, they are still human and will make mistakes if they do not rely on God's help. Nonetheless, Augustine admits that Plato has more claim to be revered as divine or semi-divine than any god, if he is to be judged on the grounds of virtuous teaching. He writes, "Were it not more accordant with every virtuous sentiment to read Plato's writings in the temple of Plato than to be present in the temples of devils, to witness the priests of Cybele mutilating themselves, the effeminate being consecrated, the raving fanatics cutting themselves, and whatever cruel or shameful or shamefully cruel or cruelly shameful ceremonies enjoined by rituals of such gods as these." For Augustine, the rituals and stories of the Roman gods often celebrate vice and excess and can in fact justify licentious behaviour. He cites an example from Terence's play from the 2nd century BC, where a young man, upon seeing a depiction of Jupiter's immoral act, uses it as a justification for his own behaviour, arguing that if the gods can behave in such a way, why shouldn't we? Therefore, Augustine critiques the Roman religious customs for celebrating, perpetuating vice, contrasting it with the moral teachings of the philosophers, and pointing out the danger of endorsing the immoral behaviour of the gods, as this can lead people, especially the youth, to justify their own wrongdoing. And so with that, we'll turn now to chapters 8 to 15, where Augustine provides a detailed critique of the immoral theatrical shows. In chapters 8 to 15, Augustine will provide a detailed critique of the immorality of theatrical shows. The question that first emerges is whether these plays are merely the fables of poets rather than the actions and words of the gods themselves. To this end, Augustine states that they aren't mere human fancy, but the gods themselves demanded these performances. Moreover, if these plays have divine endorsement and portray gods in questionable ways, like Job's adultery, it sets a poor moral example for humans, and this example is sanctioned by the gods. He notes that even though comedies and tragedies are less vulgar than some performances, they still discuss impure subjects. Augustine references Cicero's De Republica to highlight the Romans' views on the impropriety of theatrical performances. in which the character Scipio states that the vulgarity in comedies would not be accepted unless society first endorsed such behaviour. Cicero contrasts the moral standards of Romans, who didn't permit the living to be praised or blamed on stage, with the Greeks, for the Greeks openly named those they mocked in comedies, criticising even respected figures like Pericles, a statesman of ancient Athens during the Golden Age in the 5th century BC. Cicero instead praises the Roman law from the 12 tables, which sanctioned death for anyone who wrote or sang defamatory verses, stating that it is by the decisions of magistrates and by well-informed justice that our lives ought to be judged, and not by the flighty fancies of poets. The point for Augustine here is the Romans' vanity protected human reputations while letting the gods be openly ridiculed without restraint. The Romans took offence when poets slandered or maligned their fellow citizens to the extent of making it a capital crime, but they took no issue when their gods were the subject of derogatory verses. This, according to Augustine, shows an inconsistency in their values. Ironically, Roman law is stricter than Roman religion. On the other hand, Augustine points further to the fact that the Greeks are simply more consistent than the Romans, first in their immoral depiction of both humans and the gods. As he writes, the Greeks, therefore, seeing the character of the gods they served, thought that the poets should certainly not refrain from showing up human vices on the stage, either because they desired to be like their gods in this, or because they were afraid that if they required for themselves a more unblemished reputation than they asserted for their gods, they might provoke them to anger. Second, the Greeks in their cultural practices granted considerable civic honours to actors in plays because they believed that these performances pleased their gods, and therefore the Greeks acted more consistent with the character of their gods by not shaming or disgracing these actors. This is contrasted with the contradictory attitude of the Romans, which held actors in low esteem, even barring them from public honours and stigmatising their profession, while they simultaneously believed that these theatrical performances were dedicated to and desired by their gods. Augustine, concluding this whole discussion in chapter 13, sums it up with the following syllogism. The Greeks give us the major premise. If such gods are to be worshipped, then certainly such men may be honoured. The Romans add the minor, but such men must by no means be honoured. The Christians draw the conclusion. Therefore, such gods must by no means be worshipped. Augustine further lamented the fact that audiences, rather than just laughing at the depiction of the gods, often chose to imitate them. And the excuse made by some that stories about the gods are more inventions and not true makes no difference, given that portraying falsehood about the gods is even worse from a moral standpoint. In chapter 14, Augustine points to Plato's ideal state where poets, especially those who produce morally questionable content, are actually banished to prevent the spread of harmful ideas and the defamation of deities. The philosopher's stance, which values truth and morality, is at odds with that of the Roman gods. It is at least questionable that such immoral deities ought to be worshipped. But Augustine argues that the Romans made decisions about their deities based on vanity rather than reason, and it's only for nationalistic pride that Romulus, one of the Rome's founders, elevated above many gods, being granted the same religious honours as major deities like Jupiter, and even being ranked above deities like Neptune, Pluto, and Saturn. Therefore, Roman religion reflects, panders to, the worst vices, lust and grovelling flattery. That nothing good is to be found in Roman religion is evidenced by the fact that Roman law had no origin in divine inspiration, and the pagan gods did not provide guidance against moral evils, but instead sought to exasperate them. This is evidenced by the fact that Rome derived its law from Solon's legislations. As he writes, with respect then to moral evils, evils of life and conduct, evils which are so mighty that according to the wisest pagans, by them states are ruined while their cities stand uninjured, Their gods made not the smallest provision for preserving their worshippers from these evils, but on the contrary took special pains to increase them, as we have previously endeavoured to prove. So, next Augustine will return to his main point in Book 2, the presence of evils and misfortunes in Roman history, even when its gods were worshipped. So, what has come before leads on to the main argument of Book 2, that the constant presence of evils and misfortunes in Roman history from which the gods did not or would not save Rome. As such, Augustine now seeks to deconstruct the assumption of the first century historian Sallust, whom he has frequently referenced when it comes to the moral decline of Rome. Sallust lamented the decline in Roman values and frequently harked back to what he perceived as a golden age of Roman virtue. This likely encompasses the century merely following the founding of Rome, the expulsion of the last Roman king, and the founding of the Roman Republic, and lasted up to perhaps the Punic Wars or just thereafter. Augustine attacks this implicit golden age assumption, summed up in a quote from Sallust, which states that equity and virtue prevailed among the Romans not more by force of laws than of nature. In other words, Sallust is saying that Romans were naturally inclined towards fairness and virtue. It wasn't just that the laws made them act righteously, but it was that their very nature was to be just and virtuous. In essence, Sallust is emphasizing the inherent goodness and moral fibre of the Romans during that period, which made them uphold virtuous conduct not merely out of legal obligation, but because it was instinctive and innate to them. Augustine deconstructs this view first by citing the infamous incident of the abduction of the Sabine woman as a blatant display of hypocrisy. This incident occurred apparently after the founding of the city of Rome by Romulus, its first king in the 8th century BC. The population of Rome consisted mostly of men, as it was founded primarily by exiles, refugees, and outlaws, and therefore to ensure the city's growth, they needed women. As such, Romulus devised a plan and announced a grand festival inviting the neighbouring Sabines, among other Italian tribes, to partake in the celebrations. As the festival reached its peak, at a signal from Romulus, the Romans grabbed the Sabine women, abducting them from their families, and caused their men to flee in panic. He writes, "What indeed could be more equitable and virtuous than by carrying off by force, as each man was fit, without their parents' consent, girls who were strangers and guests, and who had been decoyed and entrapped by the pretense of a spectacle." To add to this, the Romans made Romulus a god, despite him perpetuating this iniquity. Moving to an episode immediately following the establishment of the Roman Republic in 509 is the ousting of Lucretia's innocent husband and his colleague into resignation exile merely because of their familial ties to the Tarquins. Now, for those who don't know, the last Roman king, Tarquin, was ousted by a group of senators led by Lucius Junius Brutus due to the rape of Lucretia by his son, which led to the end of the monarchy and establishment of the Roman Republic. Nonetheless, in an act of total injustice, Junius Brutus, the consul, forced Colatius, the husband of Lucretia, into exile. Another instance is that of Marcus Camillus from the 5th century, who's often referred to as the second founder of Rome, due to his significant contributions to the defense and expansion of the city. Nonetheless, after successfully conquering the Veians and securing Rome when it was under threat, he faced false charges due to envy and political rivalries. Despite his significant contributions, he was not shown gratitude, leading him to go into exile and face a hefty fine. Even so, Rome would later recall him from exile as he needed his aid against the Gauls. This narrative for Augustine highlights that Roman politics were not driven by genuine pursuit of justice and virtue, but often by personal ambitions and rivalries, where power struggles overshadowed genuine merit and virtue. Referring again to Sallust, Augustine writes in chapter 18, I will therefore pause and adduce the testimony of Sallust himself, whose words in praise of the Romans that equity and virtue prevailed among them, not by force of laws, than of nature, have given occasion to this discussion. He was referring to that period immediately after the expulsion of the kings, in which the city became great in an incredibly short space of time. And yet this same writer acknowledges in the first book of his history, in the very exordium of his work, that even at that time, when a very brief interval elapsed after the government had passed from kings to consuls, the more powerful men began to act unjustly and occasioned the defection of the people from the patricians and other disorders in the city. Therefore, even in Sallust's depiction of the early Roman Republic, his golden age, powerful individuals acted unjustly, leading to societal disorder and the marginalization of people by the patricians. Moreover, while Sallust notes the Romans maintained harmony, societal purity during the time between the Second and Third Punic Wars, this was more due to the fear of external threats, such as Carthage, than genuine civic virtue. But then, after the fall of Carthage, there is for Sallust a rapid decline of the moral fabric of Rome, with greed, ambition, and other vices becoming rampant. Augustine further discusses the challenges faced by the common people under the patricians, stating that shortly after the founding of the Roman Republic, the patricians, as he writes, treated the people as their slaves, ordering them to be scourged or beheaded just as the kings had done, driving them from their holdings, and harshly tyrannizing over those who had no property to lose. This led to revolts, most notably with the people succeeding to Mount Aventine and Mount Seca, demanding tribunes and protective laws. Therefore, even a few years after the expulsion of the kings, with the dawn of the so-called Golden Age, is hardly a period, as Sallust suggested, when that equity and virtue prevailed among them, not by force of law, than of nature. If this Golden Age is so unjust, then the question arises as to the period of moral decay which happens, according to Sallust, after the destruction of Carthage in 149 BC. Augustine writes, his brief sum and sketch of this period may be read in his own history, which he shows how profligate manners which were propagated by prosperity resulted at last even in civil wars. He says, and from this time the primitive manners, instead of undergoing an insensible alteration as hitherto they had done, they were swept away as by a torrent, as the young men were so depraved by luxury and avarice that it may justly be said that no father had a son who could either preserve his own patrimony or keep his hands off the other men's. Sallust adds a number of particulars about the vices of Sylla and the debased condition of the Republic in general, and other writers make similar observations, though in much less striking language. Therefore, Augustine gets to the main point of his argument here, that all of these moral failings occurred before the birth of Christ. Therefore, in chapter 19, Augustine reiterates that the Roman Republic, once admired for its virtues, had deteriorated morally over time. And this downfall wasn't first noted by him, but by the Roman historians who highlighted decline long before Christ's advent. According to them, after the fall of Carthage, there was a rapid decline in Roman values, with the youth especially being drawn towards luxury and greed. Augustine challenges the Romans to showcase any laws given by their gods that directly tackle these vices. Commandments in the prophets, the Gospels, Acts of the Apostles, or the Epistles include many precepts against avarice and luxury. They are, as he writes, everywhere read to congregations that meet for this purpose, and which strike the ear not with the uncertain sound of philosophical discussion, but with the thunder of God's own oracle, pealing from the clouds. Therefore, the Romans don't blame their gods for their past debauchery and hastily accuse Christianity for recent tribulations. But as Augustine argues, if everyone actually heeded Christian teachings about righteousness and virtue, there would in fact be universal peace and prosperity. Nonetheless, the allure of vice and disdain towards virtue means that universal peace and prosperity is not possible now, and as such, Christians are advised to persevere in the face of this morally corrupt age to secure their place in a most holy and august assembly of the angels and republic of heaven, in which the will of God is the law. Therefore, Augustine used a political language to contrast the flawed earthly commonwealth with the perfect heavenly commonwealth, in which the angels are a kind of senate. Chapter 20, Augustine will lay out clearly the values and desires of societies that worship pagan gods, as they emulate the vices and debauches of them. As such, Augustine paints a vivid picture of Roman society, which is obsessed with wealth, peace, and military success, but is in practice a vehicle for greed and exploitation, extravagance, and immorality. He writes, "Only let it remain undefeated," they say. "Only let it flourish and abound in resources. Let it be glorious by its victories, or still better, secure in peace. And what matters it to us?" Well, there are several issues with this, as Augustine lays out. First, it is made of social hierarchies that enable the rich and powerful to exploit the weak. He states, "Let the poor court the rich for a living, and that under their protection they may enjoy a sluggish tranquility, and let the rich abuse the poor as their dependents to minister to their pride." Secondly, a society that values pleasure and entertainment over genuine leadership and public interest or common good. He states, "Let the people applaud not those who protect their interests, but those who provide them with pleasure." Third, is a society in which kings prioritize subservience and wealth over the well-being and righteousness of their subjects. He states, "Let the provinces stand loyal to the kings, not as moral guides, but as lords of their possessions and purveyors of their pleasures, not with a hearty reverence, but a crooked and servile fear." Fourth, laws focus more on property rights than personal rights. He states, "Let the laws take cognizance rather of the injury done to another man's property than of that done to one's own person." Fifth, is a culture rife with indulgence, from public prostitution to extravagant banquets. He states, "Let there be plentiful supply of public prostitutes for everyone who wishes to use them, but specifically for those who are too poor to keep one for their private use. Let there be erected houses of the largest and most ornate description. In these let there be provided the most sumptuous banquets, where everyone who pleases may, by day or night, play, drink, vomit, dissipate. Let there be everywhere heard the rustling of dancers, the loud, immodest laughter of the theatre. Let a succession of the most cruel and most voluptuous pleasures maintain a perpetual excitement. Last of all, those opposing this lifestyle are ostracized or punished." This state of affair for Augustine is all the product of the worship of the pagan gods, that apparently provide peace and security from external foes, plagues, or disasters, demanding whatever gains they please, but at the expense of any moral righteousness. The words of Jesus ring through what Augustine says. "For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul?" In essence, Augustine lambastes a society in which pleasure, self-indulgence, and materialism are perceived above all else, underlying the dangers of such values and the gods that endorse them. In chapter 21, there is in Augustine a discussion of Cicero's res publica, which means public property or commonwealth, as opposed to private property. Cicero, an esteemed Roman orator and statesman from the 1st century BC, discusses in this book the principles of Roman constitutional governance. He outlines forms of governance such as monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, suggesting that a balanced blend of these forms is optimal. Taking inspiration from Plato's Republic, Cicero's work unfolds as a Socratic dialogue with Scipio Aemilianus, a 2nd century BC Roman general statesman, serving as the wise sage. Through Scipio, Cicero conveys his thoughts, seamlessly merging rhetorical tactics with classic literary techniques to critically assess the state of the Roman Republic in his era. Augustine finds Cicero's discourse significant, especially since, like the previously mentioned historian Sallust, Cicero lamented the decline of the Roman Republic, even declaring its effective demise. Given Cicero's stature, Augustine leveraged his perspective to strengthen his own argument. Augustine states, "If they therefore pooh-pooh the testimony of Sallust to its utterly wicked and profligate condition, what will they make of Cicero's statement that even in his time it had become entirely extinct, and that there remained extant no Roman Republic at all?" In Cicero's work, it recalls a dialogue involving Scipio, who uses musical harmony as an analogy for the proper function of a state. Just as harmony requires different sounds to work in concord, a state requires various social elements to work in harmony, and emphasizes the vital role of justice in maintaining this harmony. The crux of the discussion revolves around the prevailing notion that the Republic cannot be governed without injustice. While characters like Pillus support this idea, suggesting that injustice might be necessary for governing a Roman Republic, Scipio strongly counters this belief. He believes not only is this a notion as baseless and unfounded, but also that true governance can only be retrieved with the most absolute justice. Scipio further defines a republic as the well-being of the people and clarifies that the people isn't just any group, but one united by shared laws and mutual interests. If the ruling entity, whether a monarch, aristocrat, or the populace, acts unjustly, then based on this definition, the republic ceases to exist. As Augustine writes, "But when the monarch is unjust, or as the Greeks say, a tyrant, or the aristocrats are unjust and form a faction, or the people themselves are unjust and become, as Scipio, for want of a better name, calls themselves the tyrants, then the republic is not only blemished, as had been proved the day before, but by legitimate deduction from these definitions, it altogether ceases to be." Therefore, Augustine argues that by the time of Sallust's writings, the Roman Republic had not just deteriorated, but had ceased to exist entirely. This is reinforced by Cicero's lamentation that his contemporary Rome had lost its foundational morality, retaining only the nominal title of a republic. Cicero states, "For it is through our vices and not by our mishap that we retain only the name of a republic and have long since lost the reality." This confession of Cicero of the death of the Roman Republic through its vices is proclaimed long before the coming of Christ. First, then, it cannot be imputed to Christianity. And secondly, their gods do not take steps to prevent the decay and extinction of that republic. But more than this, as Augustine recognizes from the definitions in which Cicero himself gives, Rome never was a republic because true justice never took place. Therefore, Augustine posits that the only true republic defined by genuine justice is the city of God. As he states, true justice has no existence save in that republic, whose founder and ruler is Christ. This city, unlike any earthly entity, embodies the essence of pure justice and represents the ideal republic, yet is not a city of the present world. So, from chapters 22 to 27, Augustine turns to the indifference of the gods towards human virtue. In chapter 22, Augustine argues that, contrary to the claims of some, the Roman Republic was morally corrupt long before the advent of Christianity. He critiques the supposed guardian gods of Rome, questioning why, given their extensive worship, they did not provide moral guidance to prevent moral decline. Instead, these deities seemed more concerned with their own honour than with the moral integrity of their worshippers. Augustine also challenges defenders of these gods to present any moral laws they gave that could have prevented the chaotic actions of historical figures like Gracchi, Marius, Sina, Carbo, and Sylla. He then addresses the idea that these gods might have abandoned Rome due to its moral decay, citing Virgil's lines from the Aeneid about the deities leaving their temples. Gone from each fane, each sacred shrine, are those who made this realm divine. But Augustine points out the inconsistency of this argument. These gods abandoned Rome due to its immorality. Then they can't blame Christianity for Rome's decline. Furthermore, these gods were absent during earlier crises, like when the Gauls sacked Rome. Augustine will further question the nature of the gods that would abandon their worshippers without even guiding them morally. He writes, "Now the departure of the gods from each fane, each sacred shrine, and their abandonment of the city to destruction was an act of injustice if their laws inculcating justice and moral life had been held in contempt by that city. But what kind of gods were these? Pray, who declined to live with the people who worshipped them, and whose corrupt life they had done nothing to reform. In essence, it would be illogical for the gods to abandon their devoted city due to its moral downfall, especially when they made no efforts to rectify its moral decline." Furthermore, in chapter 23, Augustine points to the inconsistency of the Roman gods in influencing the lives and fortunes of individuals. Using the contrasting examples of Marius and Regulus, he notes that if the gods truly influence earthly affairs, then why did they favour Marius, known for his vices and cruelty, and forsake Regulus, celebrated for his virtue? Augustine points out that this inconsistency in fortune suggests that either the gods are useless in temporal matters or that they are unjust. Another example he explores in chapter 24 is the life of Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix, commonly known as Sulla. For Sulla, despite his cruel and destructive actions, especially during the Civil War and his rule, he consistently receives positive and encouraging omens from the gods. Augustine therefore criticized the gods, whom he identifies as demons, for their unwillingness to support and guide Sulla towards victory and power without ever directing him towards virtue or moral restraint. Augustine writes, "The truth is, as I have often said, and as Scripture informs, and as the facts themselves sufficiently indicate, the demons are found to look after their own ends only, that they may be regarded and worshipped as gods, and that men may be induced to offer them a worship which associates them with their crimes, and involves them in one common wickedness and judgment of God." Therefore, this serves to highlight Augustine's view of pagan gods as malevolent beings, more interested in human subjugation than moral guidance or improvement. And so, Augustine will turn next in chapters 28-29 to the need for people to turn to Christ for true piety and virtue. So, as Augustine comes to the end of Book 2, in chapter 28, he argues that, in contrast to the immoral paganism he has exposed, the Christian religion is immensely beneficial and health-giving. In fact, Augustine highlights that in church, the Holy Scriptures and righteous teachings are proclaimed publicly, offering salvation to those who follow them and judgment to those who do not. Even those who initially mock these teachings often find their attitude changed or subdued by fear or shame. In the Christian assembly, as he writes, no filthy and wicked action is there set forth to be gazed at or to be imitated, but but either the precepts of the true God are recommended, his miracles narrated, his gifts praised, or his benefits implored. Finally, in chapter 29, Augustine exhorts the Romans to abandon paganism and embrace Christianity. He points to their noble heritage, urging them to seek true piety, which purifies and perfects virtue, rather than the false glory and deceit of pagan gods. He calls on the Romans to recognize that true praise belongs to God, not to themselves, and to awaken to the true faith exemplified by those who have suffered and died for it. Augustine invites the Romans to join the Christian community, highlighting the genuine remission of sins and eternal reign offered by God, contrasting it with the temporal impure worship of false gods. He criticizes the malign spirits they call gods, arguing that these spirits envy human happiness and are unworthy of worship. Augustine concludes by promising to demonstrate in the next book that the demons lack the power attributed to them, that even if they had such power, it would be better to reject the fleeting benefits they offer rather than worship them and miss eternal blessings. And so he urges the Romans to cleanse their worship through Christianity and seek the heavenly cities, eternal and pure joys. And so, that is it for Book 2 of The City of God, in which Augustine critiques Roman society, focusing on the moral weaknesses tied to pagan gods. And for Augustine, there was no golden era of the Roman Republic, nor any republic to speak of, as true justice never existed, due to the worship of immoral pagan gods. As such, Rome's decline isn't due to Christianity, but rather the flawed teachings in pagan worship. Instead, Augustine urges Romans to embrace Christ's true teachings for a virtuous society. For the only true republic, defined by genuine justice, is the city of God. So, with that, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this overview of Book 2 of the City of God. If you have enjoyed it, please let me know your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to get notified of any future videos. So, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time, whenever that is. Bye!